Hello everybody and welcome to my channel. World Rapid and Blitz Championships are over, however, I really feel the need to film this video because there is an unsung hero of these tournaments, the one that hasn't been featured in any YouTube videos, hasn't been spoken about a lot, but certainly has to be, because his name is Alexey Sarana and his performance in Blitz was something special. The thing is, he started the tournament with 3 out of 8. Not a spectacular result, you will say. Well, that is true. And you would never think that he would, end up anywhere near the podium or the prizes or anywhere near that. However, in the next 11 rounds, he did score 10.5 out of 11 points. And you might wonder, well, maybe his opponents weren't that good, and, well, yeah, some of his opponents were not world-class, maybe leaders or the elite players. However, almost all of his opponents were grandmasters, and among those, in rounds 17 and 18, he did beat 2 world champions in a row. First, he beat Hikaru Nakamura, the current Fischer Random world champion. And then, in round 18, he did beat none other than Magnus Carlsen, the current world classical so far, Blitz and Rapid world champion. So the absolute world champion in chess. So without further ado, let's jump right into the games. And the first one, we're going to see the game with Hikaru Nakamura because it was round 17. And Alexey always starts with d4. He's a very classical, sound player. Nakamura goes knight f6, c4, knight c6. So this is called as, 2 knight tango, at least that's what I call this, and it's not really a very sound opening, can't recommend to play this. However, as you know, Nakamura, he is actually a very heavy theoretician, but jokes aside, he knows very well his theory, but he just likes playing these offbeat openings. So if he plays these, I'm pretty sure he knows some stuff in these openings. And jumping over here, it's a blitz game, so we will kind of skim through this opening part. So far, Alexey develops as if it was some sort of Catalan opening, whereas Hikaru is playing some hybrid of the Grunfeld and maybe, Queen's Indian with his bishop on b7, so something like that. So Queen c2 here, rook to c1, knight e7, then Sarana takes on d5, e takes d5, knight e5, jumping into the center, then c5, d takes c5, b takes c5, rook f to d1. And what we see here with you is what's called hanging pawns that we see on d5 and c5. Now, there is a certain way you're supposed to play with hanging pawns. It is pretty similar to the way you should be playing with an isolated pawn. So you have to play for piece activity, you have to retain minor pieces on the board, and you have to try and create some maybe attack or some active stuff happening in the center. Otherwise, you will be squeezed positionally because your pawns are weak. Your pawns are weaknesses, but they are temporary weaknesses that give you some activity. So Nakamura plays Queen a5, and this turns out to be not a very good move. And the better way to play this was to play knight f5, let's say e3 by Sarana, and then rook e8. And if knight d3, then actually sacrificing a rook. Can you imagine? This is the best move. Rook takes e3 out of nowhere, literally nowhere. And then you might think, well, takes, at least he gets the exchange back, right? So he just sacrificed 2 pieces for 2, he just sacrificed the piece for 2 pawns. Well, not really. After this, he doesn't even take the rook. Knight g2, king takes g2, and then d4. King moves away, queen to d5, lining up the queen and the bishop together, threatening some checkmates, and the game might be over very, very soon for white. This is the way Nakamura was supposed to play, starting from here. But he didn't. He played Queen a5, a more naturally looking move, and then after e3, rook d8, a3, knight e8. So Nakamura is not playing very actively. As you can see, he's dropping his pieces back. And so knight d3, trade, that is exactly what Sarana wants, to trade off some minor pieces. Then we see that once they come off the board, it's not really all that easy for black to create active play. So after queen b6, b4 is a great move, trying to fix a weakness on c5, and if black takes, then takes back here, fixing the square on c5. So Nakamura plays c4, and then after knight f4, putting pressure on the d5 pawn, knight f6, knight takes c4, nice tactics by Sarana, spotted quickly. The idea is that the queen on b6 is a little bit overloaded, it's defending on f6, and it's defending on b7. at the same time. So if black takes here, then, you know, Sarana can just take the rook, take, and then take the bishop first. Black has to take back, and then take on f6. White ends up very nicely up a pawn in a great position. So something similar happened in the game after knight takes c4. Rook takes c4 was played by Hikaru, takes on d8, and then bishop b7, and white ends up a pawn in a nice position as well. So knight f5, bishop f3. As you can see, both players are now down to a minute on the clock, so the game starts, you know, going in a little bit more of a rushed manner. Queen d5, bishop e2, knight d6, then queen c3, putting pressure on c4, h5, sacrificing a pawn just so that the c pawn can run up. So takes, knight e4, and then knight d2. Hikaru is creating some threats on these light squares and maybe trying to confuse the position, you know, muddy the waters a little bit. Bishop e2 played by Sarana, f5, a4, g4, fixing this square on f3, then b5, knight f3 check, and then after takes, Hikaru takes with the pawn, so that the king now is stuck on the back rank. And Alexey never can really move the queen away from the back rank because of queen d1. Not only if, maybe only if he, you know, moves somewhere along this diagonal to cover the f1 square. So king f1, c3 sacrificing a pawn, and if you take it, it's mate. No, it's not. Queen d1, queen e1. Well, at least Hikaru gets the pawn back, but then queen b1, threatening the pawn on f5. King g7, h3, king g6. As you can see by the time, we're already approaching this, you know, purely increment, almost zone 11 versus 17 seconds. g4 played by Sarana, great move, pinning the pawn, and it might seem like black's position is falling apart, but hey, after king h6, g takes f5 played by Sarana pretty quickly, and here Nakamura misses his chance. What he should have done, he could actually win the game here, which is queen to c4, check. If the king goes to e1, of course it's mate. If the king goes to g1, well then, queen g8, nice geometry, king moves away, it's checkmate, and if the king moves to f1, then queen to g2, followed by queen g1, wins the queen. That was a miss, because Hikaru, spending 1 second, played king g5. King g1, and then obviously the position is winning for white, because there is no second chance to win like that for Hikaru. So Sarana technically wins this pawn with checks, then gets the queen back and sacrifices the pawn, but it doesn't matter because he soon gets the other pawn, and then after this he just smoothly runs up his pawns and the queen and the king. Going here, it's literally impossible to blunder for white unless maybe he stalemates somehow, but Sarana is careful enough not to do that. He also gained some time on these moves, so check, check, f4, moving the king up, and eventually king h6. And the checkmate on h7 is unstoppable. If you play queen g8, then queen f6. So here Hikaru Nakamura resigns, and the reign of Sarana continues. So the next game is the game of Sarana against Magnus Carlsen, and again Alexey is white, and again he starts off with d4. Now what we see in this game is a very practical, very calm approach, because this is the Queen's Gambit declined, and you know this is a pretty decent, very solid, but also very boring opening. Well, Sarana turns it into something else. After takes, bishop f4. First of all, this is a very unusual move, because usually we see bishop g5 in this position. Now, Magnus spends some time. He plays c6 first, then Sarana goes e3, and then Magnus plays bishop f5, which makes sense because you should develop the bishop to this diagonal if you can, preventing the white bishop from developing first. But then Sarana plays the move that has never been played before, which is f3. Now, in this position, Magnus spent around 20 seconds on figuring out his next move, which turned out to be inaccurate. So you can say that Sarana caught Magnus off guard, or maybe just out-prepared Magnus before the event, but it is what it is. Magnus plays h5, and of course he wants to stop the g4 move. The thing is, the best move for black, as Alexey pointed out in his post-game interview, was knight h5. And that leads to very, very sharp and wild positions, because after bishop takes b8, rook takes b8, g4 is actually a possibility. But then queen h4, king moves away, and then knight g3. Now, taking this knight is not good, because queen takes h1 hits the knight as well if we take this bishop. So white should actually take on f5, and after knight takes h1, play knight h3, because now if you try to get your knight out to f2, then queen e1 will actually pin it and win it. So black needs to be careful as well with this knight, and apparently by the engine it's equal, but obviously it's still a long game to go, and it could go either way. Now, back to the game. When Magnus played h5, Sarana just played bishop d3, traded these bishops, and then went for a pretty usual plan for the Queen's Gambit declined positions, which is to get e4 in. So after this, knight e2, knight c7, e4. Now takes, 96, castles, and now just Sarana has this very nice center, very mobile center as well, so he can choose whether to push e5 or d5 or when to do it, and Sarana is really dictating the game from this point on. And amazingly, Magnus never got out of this. Magnus never got even an equal position from here. So it's quite bizarre. Bishop e7, h3, castles, rook d1, queen to b6, e5, of course, breaking through, knight d5, takes and takes, knight g3. Now Sarana tries to attack this weakness. Notice that in all of the games, in both of these games, well, not too many games, Sarana is not really using tactics unless there is some really nice tactical hit. So he's not going, you know, all in for the attack. He's not trying to just checkmate his opponent. He's rather just trying to put pressure on these weaknesses, which is really a beautiful way of playing chess. d5 is a weakness, h5 is a weakness, and then Magnus plays g6, which is creating another weakness. Dark squares on the king side, immediately used by Sarana with bishop to h6. Now, queen takes b2 played by Magnus, because if he moves the rook away, well, if rook e8, we actually have a very nice tactic. Of course, many of you viewers would see that, which is rook takes f7. Boom. King takes f7, rook f1 check, king moves back, queen to g6, and probably then, let's say rook f7. Because then, you know, the checks are over after queen d4, king h2, and black can resign because the checkmate on h7 is unstoppable. So, if rook f to d8 is played, the sacrifice on f7 doesn't work anymore because the king can take and go back to e8, but we can still play queen f3 with a completely winning position. f7 is undefendable. So Magnus decides to sacrifice an exchange with queen takes b2. Of course, Alexey accepts that, bishop takes f8, rook takes f8, and then rook to b1. Now, Magnus has a decision to make. Which pawn do we take? And by the classics, we know that taking a central pawn in the middle game is better. However, Magnus thinks, well, if I take the central pawn, then after trading the queens, rook to b7, perhaps bishop c5 and black is still okay holding on, but we're already closer to the end game, so maybe it is actually more important to take the a pawn in the initial position. And that might be true if not for specific tactical operations. First of all, after rook to b7, the rook becomes very active. Secondarily, when Magnus thinks, okay, how do I defend the bishop on e7? Well, he comes up with this idea, queen a3. But even that is not enough, because after queen takes a3, bishop takes a3, rook a1, Magnus here actually touched the the bishop in a rush, because he thought, okay, where do I move my bishop? And he tried to move it somewhere, or to e7 originally, but e7 is under control, and all the other squares on the board are under control. So, unfortunately, Magnus loses the game and he just resigned here. Now, maybe if he didn't touch his bishop, because we know the touch move rule, maybe he could have still played knight d8, but after knight d8, still rook to b5, and, well, if the bishop moves back to e7, rook takes d5, the pawn on d5 is just much too important, because a7 is also hanging, and after rook d7 or one of these moves, the pawns are just going to roll up the board. So it's losing anyway for Magnus. That's it for today's video. Hopefully you enjoyed these masterpieces. Those are really nice positional games, I feel like, for the, you know, the Russian superhero. And he did really well in the tournament, eventually coming close to, you know, the top 3. He actually shared from the 4th to the 7th place, but due to his not best tie breaks, because he started the tournament rather poorly, he came 7th in the tournament. Which is still fine. He got some prize, which is good for him, but, you know, I'm pretty sure that he is satisfied with the tournament, at least with the second half of it, because he did very well, and the last game he actually beat a very strong player, young Krzysztof Duda, and by winning that game, he then confirmed himself at least the 7th place in the tournament. So thank you guys for watching, hopefully you enjoyed that, and look forward to newer videos. There will be more videos to come, so definitely hit that subscribe button and also the notifications bell so that you never miss a video, because this channel is going to be very active. There's going to be some videos, some streams on this channel, some educational videos, playing with subscribers, and more to come. So please follow this channel and you will not be disappointed. Until then, thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.